Hi there guys, this is Max from makeitconscious.com. Hope you're doing well. Now today I'm going to be talking about habit 3, which is skillful communication. Following on from habit 2, cultivate wholesome intentions, which I discussed in yesterday's video. Go check that out if you haven't already. Now here we're moving firmly into the conduct section of the habits, or action or behavior. As we start talking about communication, we're really addressing our actions in the world and how these not only give us some clues about the state of our mind, but also help us condition the state of our mind. This is quite interesting, I think, because this is not something Jung really talked about so much. Jung's focus was really on understanding the mind and giving us an incredibly intricate model of the mind and applying therapeutic practices as he did. But when we're talking about conduct in daily life, this isn't something that Jung was known for, at least, in terms of how he guided his patients and how he helped them let go of what was holding them back and giving them trauma, but also move forward and individuate. Certainly in the Eastern traditions, such as Buddhism and frankly all religions around the world, have some kind of teaching around conduct. For someone to become a highly integrated person, understanding one's mind, doing the work there, doing the therapy, doing the shadow work, whatever it is a person needs to do, that is absolutely vital. However, you'd be hard pressed to find a highly integrated person that spoke badly, right? So it's absolutely critical, because the way we engage with the world is a reflection of our minds. And also, in order to condition our minds, we can make decisions around the way we communicate to achieve that. So communication is really important for those two reasons, which on one hand is that the way we speak and the way we communicate is very much just like an output of what's going on inside our mind. It's how we communicate thoughts and ideas, essentially, perceptions, plans. It's how we kind of assign symbols to reality in a nutshell, and then give those to other people to work with. What we see coming out of our own mouths can give us some clues, because we're not necessarily conscious of what's always going on inside our minds, hence this process, right? And so what we then hear ourselves saying, and what we see ourselves writing, and how we see ourselves even communicating with our bodies, can show us what we might not otherwise be able to see inside our own minds. So it works in that direction on one hand. On the other hand, it works also in the reverse direction, that by managing our communication, ensuring that it's skillful, we can work back on the condition of our mind. So if we feel tempted to say something that's a little bit harsh, we're doing that because there's some aversion in us on some level. There's something we don't want to bring out. There's something we don't want to see or feel. And so we speak harshly as a way to deal with that in the moment, to maintain whatever narrative we have, whatever perception of reality we have as the reason for our feeling that way. And thus it prevents us from making it conscious. It prevents us from bringing forth whatever that block is at that moment. So by managing our speech, we can actually very effectively work back on the nature of our mind. And this is absolutely essential as part of the individuation process, hence why it's habit 3. Now, just like with all 7 of these habits, there are 3 key facets, you know it already, that pertain to this habit. I'm going to go through those in summary very quickly, because they're quite simple with speech. In a nutshell, that is my speech true, useful, and kind? Is it true? Is it useful? Is it kind? So skillful communication follows those 3 facets. And if you're especially observant, you might notice that those 3, true, useful, and kind, correspond broadly to the 3 causes of suffering: unconscious and unwholeness, craving, and aversion. So I'm going to talk about each of those 3 facets now in a little bit more detail, and we can see how each of them not only gives us some clues about our mind, but also gives us a way to work back on conditioning the mind, and of course the world around us. Because when we speak skillfully, this being one of the primary ways we actually engage with the world, we are also conditioning the world to respond to us in a skillful way. And so I'll just preface this as well by saying that any conversation we have that goes well and produces good results, it's because we've abided by these three facets in some way. Whether we've done that deliberately or not, I'm sure we've all got countless examples of both conversations that have gone really well in our lives and conversations that have gone not so well, badly or terrible, right? Things that have changed the course of our lives entirely, and we think, oh, if only I had said something different there. And invariably in those situations, when things haven't gone in a favourable way based on a conversation we've had, it is always because we have not ticked all three of those boxes in some sense. We're not firing on all cylinders, so to speak. We've said something that's maybe slightly untrue or completely untrue, or outright lied maybe for a long period of time, and constructed a web of lies, perhaps. We've said something that isn't useful, superfluous, burdensome to someone else, that was purely said out of impulsivity and served our needs, or maybe was just a nuisance, maybe something we said out of greed to try and get something. Thirdly, perhaps we said something that wasn't kind, right? And so quite easy to see how that is going to produce unfavourable results in the world, as it changes other people's perception of us, and not least changes what we condition in our own minds, what seeds we plant, what seeds we water, and the guiding presumptions that we then carry around with us that essentially create our reality. So first of all, is it true? Well, the easiest way to cause a disintegrated mind is to communicate in a way that's not truthful, because quite simply here we're having to hold two models of reality simultaneously. So aside from all the practical problems of this, like Mark Twain said, that if you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. And of course, therefore, by not telling the truth, we have to hold on to multiple versions of reality, and who knows what, and keeping track of that. And that's when it becomes like a web. We talk about a web of lies, because you have to tell subsequent lies to undo the prior lies, and then they expand and compound, and there's kind of no going back from that. If there is, say, an example of where we get away with it, and we think we've gotten away with it in terms of how our immediate experience is unfolding to us, we haven't really gotten away with it, because of course we're talking about our minds here. And so if we feel that we've gotten away with telling a lie, it may appear that way in the outside world, at least for now, but what we've done in the meantime is we've conditioned the tendency to lie, right? And we haven't actually given ourselves the opportunity to face up to whatever it was that was stopping us from telling the truth, and integrate our minds in the process. Because when we aspire to, and when we attain to wholeness, we are on some level getting in touch with the truth, the way things really are. And that just quite clearly isn't going to be possible if we are entertaining what is not true. Let's think about the reasons why someone might want to not tell the truth. And it's always down to feeling, just like anything else. It's because there is something that's stopping them. There's a feeling they're not willing to feel, whether it's the feeling of being reprimanded by somebody, maybe a parent or a superior at work. Maybe it's simply the feeling of being perceived a certain way. Like maybe we have to try and create a certain perception of ourselves in order to be perceived a certain way. So this is absolutely born out of the persona and the ego, and holding some things as me and identifying with those things, and by necessity casting what we think is not me into the shadow. And another really important point here as well is that we don't merely lie with our words. Sometimes the ego tries to find a little out here, doesn't it? Like, if I didn't tell an outright lie, then it's okay, right? Well, of course, in terms of the path to individuation, the theme, right? It's make it conscious. It's that we're working on our own mind. So if the intention there, let's say we use our tone to create a slightly different impression of reality to the one we know to be true. Or let's say we don't tell an outright lie, but we just omit something. We just kind of happen to leave something out that might be actually quite useful. Or we engage in some kind of deceit. So it's not an outright lie, but it's a deliberate misdirection. A misdirection, some kind of sleight of hand, or a maximization or a minimization. The theme to all of these things, of course, is that we're not being willing to look at the actual truth. So we're not actually setting the intention to look, and therefore we are fostering the unconscious and casting elements into the unconscious, which will inevitably rear their head at some point. So that's the first facet, which is it true, or communicate the truth. The second facet of habit 3 is to communicate what is useful. So this is a little bit more intricate than it seems on the surface, perhaps, because I think there is a perhaps widely held belief that little chit chat is actually pretty harmless, right? It's just making conversation, social oil. What's the harm? Well, it's not actually always harmful. There's a lot to be said for getting to know people, obviously, and just engaging in conversation, engaging in small talk. Jung himself, even though he wasn't naturally drawn to small talk, he explicitly acknowledged the value of it. And he even said in a letter that he wrote that acknowledged the altruism that exists at the heart of small talk. But this isn't quite what we're talking about here. This facet is really about purposeless speech. Speech that is unhelpful, useless, facetious, untimely, irrelevant. And now what underpins all of this is that this is typically speech that is said out of a kind of impulsivity. See, this aligns to craving, the cause of suffering that is craving. So this is any kind of speech that is just said because we just need to say it. We just need to get that out. It's a pattern, it's a habit that's been conditioned. And it's, again, occurring because there's a feeling at the heart of it that we're not giving ourselves the opportunity to feel. And so even though this might appear as speech that is, say, true and kind, but it may not be useful, and therefore we may convince ourselves it's actually okay because it is true and it is kind. But really, if we set the intention to look and ask the question, why am I doing what I'm doing here? Why am I communicating this right now and in this way? We might just see that actually it's about us. We're saying this thing, we're saying this useless thing because we have a need. And there's an ego defense there, a rationalization that says, this is something that this other person needs to hear. Something you might see quite often is when people email you articles they've discovered that they think that you really need to read, or that they hope you will find useful. But of course, sometimes that is very useful. But we have to be careful with things like that because, is it relevant to this other person? Is it timely? Do they have other things going on? If we're saying things at a time that's completely inappropriate for the other person, then the question is, well, why are we saying it? Why are we saying it now? Of course, it's because it's about us and it's about our craving deep down, and we're just not seeing that. So if we send emails off that are actually quite irrelevant to other people, there's an opportunity there to look back at ourselves and say, again, ask those questions. What am I not seeing? What am I craving? And what am I pushing away? Like, what's at the heart of this for me? That has an opportunity for integration and a step towards individuation if we're willing to take that look. So just to round off the second facet, this is really speech that's driven by a craving, a compulsivity or an impulsivity. And if we can notice that craving and let that go, then we're going to notice that our communication improves drastically, and that will massively also improve people's propensity to listen to us and the quality of our relationships. The third facet of habit 3 is communicate what is kind. So seems quite straightforward, this one, right? And a very powerful technique here is to use our speech to condition our mind, like I said. And if we experience our mind as being angry, we know there's a lot of aversion going on, there's things that we're hiding, we can actually use kind communication as a way to bring that out. So if we're noticing that there is anger in the mind and we want to cultivate loving kindness, one way we can do that is by speaking kind words. And this isn't a case of overdoing it, by the way. We're not trying to make things other than what they are. We're certainly not trying to see things through rose-tinted glasses, because that's just more repression, that's just more clinging, right? It's about seeing things as they are. It's about finding that middle. It's about integrating the opposite. So it's a really important point here that communicating what is kind is not the same as what I call being nicey-nicey, because in both these extremes, whether we're being harsh and angry or whether we're being all nicey, we're hiding something in both of those situations. So kind, skillful communication is about bringing those two together, making it conscious and finding that middle way. If, on the other hand, we speak with anger, essentially what we're doing there is we're conditioning aversion. And again, if you remember that the intention to love is really about bringing out what we've hidden. And so when we're speaking with anger, it's really because there's something in us that we've repressed, and most likely that is something that is showing up to us externally in another individual. So let's say we identify as someone who's really nice and really pleasant with people. Well, we then repress the side of us that is fearful of being seen as not nice, being seen as unpleasant, and maybe harsh with people. Of course, what's then going to show up, right? We're going to then start seeing that in the world around us, and when we do, we're going to feel a lot of aversion towards it, because really what we're seeing is an element of our own personality that we've repressed, that isn't conscious, and is therefore driving us from behind the scenes. In these situations, we can notice the mind, first of all, leaning in that direction. It wants to start speaking out of anger. We can stop ourselves and then make the decision to communicate with kindness. And at that point, we actually then start working on that projection, works back on our own mind. Suddenly we start realizing, maybe actually this is a more skillful way to go about life. Maybe this is producing better results for me. And maybe that anger I'm holding, that's actually now being redirected in consciousness because I'm choosing to communicate what is kind. Another way this can show up is in complaining. So if you think about what complaining is, it's really refusing to accept a reality of something. And complaining can be born out of being attached to something, but also being averse to something and not bringing something into consciousness. But complaining can be a really useful mindfulness alarm, first of all. Like if we notice ourselves complaining, such a valuable opportunity actually in many ways to say, oh look, I notice what's going on here. And likewise, the reverse is true. We can use that as a way to condition our mind. There's a really great challenge you can do, say like quit complaining for 30 days. It's an absolutely super powerful way to condition your mind, especially in regards to this third facet, which is about really working on our aversion and our mind's tendency to push things away. And lastly, I've got to mention gossip, right? Gossip is essentially saying things behind people's backs, or saying things in private that you wouldn't say publicly. Gossip is something that can just come out very readily. And another great practice here on the theme of communicating what is kind, and in fact communicating what is true and useful, if we notice ourselves speaking about someone who's not present in any sense, actually, that's a very good time to notice what's going on. There's never a bad time to notice what's going on, but that can be another little mindfulness alarm. We can use that to catch ourselves and make sure that we are speaking what is true, speaking what is useful, and speaking what is kind. Now, there's one more really important point I want to relay to you here before we wrap up, which is that this habit is called skillful communication, not skillful speech, because of course communication in the modern age is multifaceted. We don't just have speech, we have the telephone, we have email, we have text messages and WhatsApp. Wow, we have TikTok, right? We have, not to mention our tone and body language, all these things that have existed as long as humans have. And of course, this applies to all of those methods. It is a slightly different practice in each one. When we're sending an email, for example, it's still wholesome to abide by these three facets. Is what we're saying true? Is it useful? Is it kind? Slightly different game there though, because of course, on one hand, we have a lot more time to think about the email, to write it out, to draft it, to go away for half an hour and come back, see it with fresh eyes. I'm sure we've all done that at some point. On the other hand, text-based communication is almost devoid of tone. And so it can be interpreted in an even greater number of ways. There's even more ambiguity about the tone of an email. So there's an extra element of care that ought to be added there as well if we are to abide by this habit and keep working to integrate our mind. But it can actually be a really useful practice, is to really monitor our communication in text not least in email, but in WhatsApp and things like this, if we find ourselves just pinging messages back and forth, what does that sound like? Is it useful, right? Or are we just doing this because we just want to get to the end? We just want some resolution. We're just doing this out of craving. So all of these methods have their own advantages and how they can show us something about our mind and give us opportunities to work back and condition our mind, but not least just our own mind, but our relationships in the world around us. So this third habit of skillful communication, even though it's not conventionally associated with individuation, certainly as Jung taught it, it is absolutely vital if we are to integrate our minds, become highly integrated people, and live without conflict. Then the way we communicate with the world is an absolutely vital part of that journey and that practice. So I'll leave that there. I hope that was useful, guys. I shall chat to you next time.